The silence before the cross. The story begins not in stone churches, but in mist. Before the Bible came to Britain, there was silence, not emptiness, but a sacred stillness that breathed through the hills and forests of this ancient island. The people who lived here saw no boundary between the divine and the earth. The sky was a spirit, the thunder a god's voice, and the forests a living temple. Every sunrise was an act of worship, every storm a sermon. This was not ignorance. It was intimacy. To the Anglo-Saxons, the world itself was alive, wrapped in power, mystery, and fate. The Romans had long gone, leaving behind crumbling villas, broken roads, and a people untethered from empire. Into this emptiness came new tribes from across the North Sea: Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, carrying with them not only iron and fire, but stories older than the stones of Rome. Their ships, carved with dragon heads, sliced through grey waters like omens. And upon these shores they brought their gods unseen, unrecorded, but deeply felt. In their tongues, these gods had names that carried weight like thunder: Woden, Thunor, Tew, and Frigg. To the people who followed them, faith was not a doctrine, it was survival. Imagine a winter night in the 5th century, a hall of timber and smoke, its walls echoing with the laughter of warriors and the crackle of the hearth. At the center, the Scop, the tribal poet, raises his voice. He tells of gods who forged the world, who gave men courage and women wisdom. No scripture binds his tale, no parchment records it. It lives only in memory and firelight. The gods of the Anglo-Saxons were not distant rulers, but kin, flawed, fierce, and bound to the same fate as men. Even the divine could bleed, and that made them worthy of reverence. Their worship had no temples of marble. Instead, sacred groves and standing stones marked the places where the divine was believed to dwell. Oak trees were holy, rivers were offerings, hilltops were altars where the people could feel the breath of Woden in the wind. These places were not built, they were discovered. There were no sermons, no choir hymns, only the rustle of leaves, the beating of drums, and the quiet murmur of prayer rising with the smoke of sacrifice. To the Anglo-Saxon mind, life was woven into word, the great thread of fate that bound gods and men alike. No one escaped it. Every battle, every birth, every storm upon the sea was part of a pattern too vast to see. It was not a cruel destiny, but a sacred truth, that all things were connected. And that courage was found not in denying death, but in meeting it with open eyes. They believed a good death could echo longer than a lifetime, that a man's name, sung by his kin, was his afterlife. In a world without written faith, memory was immortality. But this was no utopia. The pagan world was wild, unpredictable, and bound by the harsh rhythm of nature. Winters could starve whole villages. A failed harvest could break the spirit of a clan. Disease and war haunted them like shadows. In such a world, the gods were not gentle comforters, but fierce companions, reflections of a land both beautiful and brutal. They were not worshipped to seek peace, but to earn strength. And when the thunder rolled, or the wolf howled beyond the forest, people whispered prayers, not of love, but of survival. The Anglo-Saxon heart beat with reverence for the unseen, a reverence that did not separate the sacred from the mundane. A warrior might whisper to Thunor before battle, a mother might call to Frigg before childbirth, and an old man might leave offerings by a river for his ancestors. Each act, small and personal, wove them into a vast spiritual web that stretched back beyond memory. This was Britain before the Bible, a land of fog and fire, of oaths and omens, where the divine was not written in words, but carved into the soul of the world. And yet, beyond the forests and seas, something was stirring. New voices whispered across distant lands of one God, of salvation, of eternal life beyond the grave. The tide of faith was shifting, though the pagans could not yet feel it. For now, the island remained in the grasp of its old gods, its heart still beating with the rhythm of the wild. But the silence before the cross never lasts forever. Soon, that silence would be broken by monks bearing books, by kings seeking new power, and by the slow, inevitable dawn of a new faith. Woden's kingdom. The god who watched over kings. He was the god behind the crown, unseen, unbound, and always watching. In the heart of the Anglo-Saxon world, one name rose above all others: Woden. To speak his name was to speak of wisdom, war, and the tangled web of fate itself. He was the chief of the gods, but not the god of comfort. Woden was the one who sacrificed himself to himself, who hung upon the great ash tree Yggdrasil to steal the runes, the secret knowledge of creation. He was both the giver of kingship and the bringer of death. In him, the Anglo-Saxons saw the mirror of their own world, brilliant, merciless, and bound to the cycles of victory and loss. To understand Woden is to understand how early English kings saw their power. A king was not merely a ruler, he was chosen by fate, descended from the god himself. The lineages of Anglo-Saxon royalty, the houses of Kent, Wessex, and Mercia, all claimed divine blood through Woden. It was not vanity, it was legitimacy. To rule was to bear the god's spirit, to wield his insight and his fury. A king who lacked courage dishonored his divine ancestor. A coward on the battlefield was not merely weak, he was faithless. Woden's essence was not kindness, but cunning. He was the wanderer, cloaked in shadow, always seeking hidden truths. In old tales, he walked among mortals, testing their hearts. Some said a stranger at the fire might be Woden in disguise, so hospitality became sacred. To turn away a traveler was to risk offending the unseen god himself. Even in his wisdom, Woden's presence was uneasy. He was a god who demanded sacrifice. For knowledge was never free, and those who sought his favor had to bleed for it, not always in flesh, but in spirit. His symbols were everywhere, though few today recognize them. The raven, for Woden's birds, Hugin and Munin, flew across the world gathering thought and memory. The wolf, his companion, prowled the edge of every battlefield. The spear, his weapon, was cast before every war to dedicate the slain to him. And the wind, ever restless, was his breath, the invisible sign that Woden was near. Even the very day of the week, Wednesday, Woden's Day, carries his echo through time, whispering the memory of a god long thought dead. To the common folk, Woden's favor was both blessing and peril. He was the source of inspiration for the poet, the war cry of the soldier, and the strange visions of the seer. Those who felt his touch were often marked by restlessness, haunted by dreams, drawn to wander, unable to find peace. They called them Woden's chosen men, who heard the winds speak and saw omens in the flight of birds. To some, they were mad, to others, holy. The line between prophecy and madness was thin, and Woden himself walked it like a blade. In the rituals of kingship, Woden's name was invoked through oaths and runes. When a new ruler was crowned, he stood upon sacred ground, surrounded by elders and warriors, raising a sword toward the heavens. He swore to protect his people and honor the gods, for his strength was not his own. The mead of oath-taking was poured upon the earth, a reminder that even kings were bound to the word, the unseen fabric that tied their fates to the gods. The songs of bards carried these oaths from hall to hall, keeping Woden's watchful eye ever upon the throne. Yet, beneath the reverence, there was fear. For Woden was not loyal, not even to his own. He was the god of change, of ends and beginnings, and he favored no man for long. A king who lost Woden's blessing could lose his crown, his people, even his soul. When famine struck or wars were lost, whispers rose in the mead halls. The god has turned away. And so kings built temples and offered gifts, gold, weapons, sometimes blood, to win back his favor. In Woden's world, even power was temporary, and only wisdom could outlast death. But beyond the rituals and oaths, something deeper stirred. Woden's image, the wise wanderer, the seeker of hidden truth, bore a strange resemblance to the stories that would soon arrive from the south, of prophets, of saviors, of divine suffering. When Christianity came, the people did not forget Woden easily. Some saw his shadow behind the new god, others cursed his name as a relic of heathen sin. But in the hearts of the people, the spirit of the wanderer lingered. The god who hung upon the tree had left his mark. For in the end, Woden was not destroyed, he was transformed. His story sank into the soil of England, re-emerging in legend, poetry, and prophecy. Every tale of wisdom gained through pain, every hero who defied fate, every poet who sought truth in suffering, all carried the echo of Woden's sacrifice. And though his temples crumbled and his priests vanished, his presence remained in the wind that still whispers through Britain's ancient trees. The kings of England would one day kneel before a different god, but they would never forget the one who taught them how to rule. For Woden had shown them that power was not granted, it was earned through courage, cunning, and sacrifice. And as the world turned toward a new faith, another god of thunder still waited beyond the clouds, his hammer ready to strike. Thunder and blood, the power of Thunor. Before the church bell rang, it was thunder that called the people to prayer. Long before the cross was raised, the skies over Britain roared with the voice of Thunor, god of thunder. His power rolled across the land like the breaking of a storm, his hammer striking lightning into the hearts of men. To the Anglo-Saxons, Thunor was not merely a god, he was the protector, the eternal defender of mankind against the chaos that lurked beyond the horizon. When the skies split open and thunder growled across the hills, they did not cower. They listened, for their god was speaking. Thunor's spirit was carved into the very rhythm of Anglo-Saxon life. Farmers called to him before the plow touched the soil, asking for rain but fearing flood. Warriors invoked his name before battle, trusting that the swing of his hammer would guide their swords. His symbol, the hammer or cross of Thunor, was worn around the necks of men and women alike, a charm against evil and misfortune. Long after Christian missionaries arrived, people continued to wear these pendants, unsure whether they honored Thunor or Christ or perhaps both, for Thunor's presence could not be erased so easily. The stories told around the hearth painted Thunor as a god of immense strength and heart, the enemy of monsters, giants, and serpents that threatened the world. Every storm was his battle made visible. His hammer, Mjolnir, cracked the heavens and drove away the forces of darkness. But unlike Woden, who ruled through wisdom and deceit, Thunor ruled through courage and justice. He was the god of action, of the roar of thunder and the swing of the blade. To follow Thunor was to live bravely, to face one's fears with defiance rather than prayer. In every village, there stood sacred sites known as Thunor's Halew's burial mounds or hills dedicated to the thunder god. People left offerings there, rings, weapons, carved idols. The air above these hills was said to shimmer when storms gathered, as if Thunor himself walked among the clouds. In the forests, the mighty oak tree was his altar, for it was often the first to be struck by lightning. Under its branches, men swore oaths, sealed marriages, and offered sacrifices of meat and ale. It was said that the crack of thunder after such offerings meant the god had accepted. To the Anglo-Saxon warrior, Thunor was more than myth. He was the ideal man. Brave, loyal, unyielding. When battle came, men believed that thunder over the field was a sign that Thunor fought beside them. They called on his strength not for victory, but for valor, for to die in courage was to join the gods in glory. And when lightning struck a tree or stone, it was not seen as destruction, but consecration. Nature itself bore the scars of Thunor's power. Yet the power that protected could also destroy. Thunderstorms that once symbolized strength became feared omens as Christianity spread. Priests warned that such storms were signs of the devil's rage, yet the old faith persisted in whispers. On stormy nights, villagers still left bread and beer at crossroads, hoping to appease the roaring heavens. And when a child fell ill, mothers whispered prayers to both Thunor and Christ, unsure which god still listened. As the new faith grew, Thunor's name began to fade, but his legacy endured. His day, Thursday, still bears his mark, Thunor's Day. His hammer lived on in the Christian cross, his storm in the church bell's ring, his protection in the saints who took his place. Even when his name was forgotten, his nature remained in the heart of the people, strong, just, defiant against the darkness. Thunor was not merely a god of weather, he was the echo of human courage against an untamed world. His roar became the pulse of a nation learning to survive both nature and empire. And when the last pagan fires dimmed, his thunder did not die, it was simply baptized, reborn in a different sky. Before angels had wings, the dawn herself was a goddess, and the earth was her womb. Not all power in the pagan world roared like thunder or ruled like kings. Some powers bloomed quietly in the soil, in birth, in love, and in dawn. Where men called upon Woden and Thunor for war and wisdom, women turned their prayers to gentler, older spirits, the goddesses of life, renewal, and fate. Among them, two shone brightest: Frigg, the mother of all, and Eosta, the goddess of spring. Together, they formed the heart of Britain's pagan soul, the rhythm of life, death, and rebirth that no sword could conquer. Frigg was the unseen strength behind every hearth. She was not worshipped with blood and battle cries, but with weaving, childbirth, and the quiet endurance of daily life. She was the wife of Woden, yet more ancient than any throne. Her wisdom was not learned from runes or war, but from silence, from watching, from knowing. To call on Frigg was to ask the world to remember mercy. In her honor, women wore charms for safe births, for love, and for the protection of their families. She was not the goddess of power, she was the goddess of purpose. The Anglo-Saxons believed that the threads of fate, the word, were woven by divine hands. Frigg and her handmaidens were those weavers. Every life was a thread spun from her loom. When a child cried its first breath, when a warrior fell in battle, when the sea took a ship, it was said that Frigg had woven it so. She did not grant escape from destiny, but she gave strength to endure it. And in this belief lay the quiet philosophy of the pagan heart, that fate was not cruelty, but a story already told, one worth living bravely. While Frigg ruled over the hearth, Eostra ruled over the horizon, the goddess of dawn, of light reborn after winter's death. When the cold months finally broke, and the first green shoots pierced the frost, her name was whispered through the villages. The people celebrated Eosterminath, the month of Eostra, a festival of fire, fertility, and renewal. Hares was sacred to her, for they were the first creatures to stir in the spring fields, and eggs symbolized the life she awakened. It was a time of joy, and promised a reminder that even after the longest winter, the earth would always rise again. Centuries later, when Christianity took root, the festival of Eostre was transformed, reborn as Easter. Her symbols remained, though her name was half forgotten. The hare became the Easter rabbit, the egg a Christian sign of resurrection. But beneath the hymns and candles, the echo of the old goddess still lingered, a whisper of the pagan dawn beneath the holy light. Even the timing of Easter, when the sun and moon find balance, carries the rhythm of Eostra's eternal renewal. To the Anglo-Saxons, goddesses like Frigg and Eostri were not merely deities, they were reflections of nature's sacred order. The earth was a mother, the dawn a daughter, the moon a watcher. Every season told a story of death and rebirth, mirroring the cycles of their own lives. When a woman gave birth, she embodied the goddess. When the land yielded crops, it was her blessing. Faith was not a doctrine to be recited, it was the living pulse of the soil. But when the Christian missionaries came, they found something they could not destroy, they could only absorb it. The Virgin Mary took on the mantle of the mother. The resurrection of Christ echoed the rebirth of Eostra's dawn. The people adapted, and so did their gods. The sacred feminine never truly left, it simply changed its name. And in quiet corners of England, under oak and ash, some still left small offerings. A flower at the roots, a whispered prayer to the earth. Frigg and Eostre taught the people something deeper than worship. They taught them reverence. They taught that creation is not only divine but maternal, that strength is not only found in steel but in nurture. Their legacy lives on not in temples, but in every sunrise, every spring bloom, every act of love that defies despair. The old goddesses still breathe through Britain's green heart, gentle, unseen, eternal. And while the goddesses watched over the living, another world stirred beneath the soil, one of shadows, runes, and restless spirits. There, the dead still whispered to the living, and the ancient language of fate was carved into stone. Runes, rituals, and the soul of the heathen. In the age before the book, the word itself was magic. The Anglo-Saxons believed that language had power, that every sound, every carved symbol was alive. Long before ink and parchment, they etched their prayers and spells into wood, bone, and stone, believing the world would listen. These were the runes, not mere letters, but keys to creation. Each rune held meaning deeper than words could tell. A whisper of fate, a weapon of spirit, a bridge between man and the divine. They said Woden himself had discovered the runes when he hung upon the great tree for 9 days and nights, wounded, alone, seeking the secret of all things. From his sacrifice came the elder Futhawk, the first runic alphabet a gift of both wisdom and danger. To carve a rune was to make a pact. Every stroke of the knife carried weight. To invoke a rune's name was to awaken what it stood for: protection, victory, love, or death. In a world without priests or cathedrals, these symbols were the Anglo-Saxon scripture. Warriors carved runes on swords to bind courage to the blade. Mothers marked them on cradles to guard their infants from the night. Farmers scratched them into the handles of plows, asking the earth to be kind. Each rune was a fragment of the cosmic pattern, a way to speak to the unseen powers that ruled all life. Rituals bound this faith together, simple, earthly acts filled with awe. On the eve of battle, warriors gathered in circles, the air thick with the scent of mead and fire. They swore oaths beneath the moon, calling the gods as witnesses. Breaking an oath was not just dishonor, it was a spiritual death. The gods of the Anglo-Saxons did not forgive lightly. In a world where word and will were sacred, a lie could curse a man more surely than any blade. The dead, too, were part of this living faith. The line between life and death was thin, a door, not a wall. When someone died, they were not gone. They simply crossed into another hall. The people buried their loved ones with weapons, jewelry, and sometimes whole ships' gifts for their journey beyond. The grave was not a place of sorrow, but of continuation. At night, fires were lit upon burial mounds, and offerings left for the spirits of ancestors who still watched over the living. To forget the dead was the only true sin. Magic, to the heathen mind, was not evil. It was knowledge, a natural force, like fire or wind. Those who could weave charms and speak with spirits were both feared and revered. They were the weech, the wise ones, the root of our word, witch. They did not conjure illusions. They sought harmony with the invisible order of the world. Their power came not from defiance of nature, but from deep understanding of it. Christianity would later call them heretics, but in the old days, they were healers, prophets, keepers of the sacred balance. The Anglo-Saxons saw the universe as a web woven of runes, breath, and will. Each life was a thread, and every act a vibration that rippled through eternity. The runes, their rituals, their songs, all were ways to feel that web, trembling with the presence of unseen power. They lived not in fear of gods, but in recognition that divinity was everywhere, in the storm, the soil, the birth cry, and the dying breath. But this world of mystery was fading. Missionaries brought their new scripture, a holy word no longer carved in bone, but bound in books. The spoken charm gave way to prayer, the rune to the cross. Yet, even as the old ways died, their echoes clung stubbornly to the language and customs of the people. The English tongue itself, with its runic roots and pagan rhythms, carried the ghost of that lost faith. The last rune was never truly erased. It lived on in secret, hidden in the songs of bards, in the patterns of folk art, in the quiet superstition of the countryside. Even the simplest gesture, a blessing before a journey, a whisper to the wind, was a remnant of the runic soul of the heathen. The book had come, but the magic of the word had never died. It simply changed its name. And as the ink of the new faith spread, the old gods began to fall silent one by one. Yet even in their silence, something of them endured, waiting beneath the cross for the moment when memory would awaken again. The day the old gods fell silent. It did not happen with thunder, nor blood. It happened with silence. There was no single day when the gods of the Anglo-Saxons died, no battlefield where Woden was slain or Thunor defeated. Their ending came softly, like mist creeping across a field at dawn. The old songs simply grew quieter. The fires at the sacred groves burned lower. The people still looked to the sky, but their prayers had changed shape. The gods did not scream as they fell, they faded, swallowed by the sound of church bells. It began in whispers, carried by strangers from the south, missionaries from Rome, speaking of a single God who demanded no sacrifices of boar or blood, only faith. To a people of earth and iron, the message was strange, a God unseen, nailed to a wooden cross, offering not power but redemption. Yet the world was changing. The kingdoms were uniting, trade was rising, and the sword of conquest was no longer the only path to glory. Christianity came not with armies at first, but with words as smooth and silver as the rivers of Kent. When King Ethelbert of Kent allowed the Roman monk Augustine to preach in 597 AD, a door opened that would never close. The old faith did not fall by the sword it was absorbed. Pagan temples became churches. Sacred wells were blessed and renamed for saints. Festivals of harvest and fire became feasts of saints and angels. To the common folk, the difference was thin. They still lit candles for the dead and whispered charms for crops, only now they spoke the name of Christ instead of Woden. But to the old priests and seers, it was a tragedy beyond words. The runes that once told of fate were called devil's marks. The wise women who had healed with herbs and moonlight were hunted as witches. The groves were cut down, the stones broken, the idols cast into rivers. It was said that when the image of Thunor was toppled at Southwark, the crowd watched for lightning, but none came. The sky was still. That silence was more terrible than thunder. In the hearts of many, though, the old world refused to die. Farmers still left bread and milk at ancient springs for luck. Mothers still tied protective knots around their children's wrists. Warriors carved runes on their blades in secret. The church called these acts superstition, but they were not that. They were memory. The memory of a world where gods walked beside men, where words carried magic, and where every tree and storm had a spirit watching. The transformation was not a conquest, but a metamorphosis. The same reverence for fate, courage, and kinship that had lived in the worship of Woden and Thunor now flowed into the language of saints and angels. The warrior still prayed for strength before battle. The farmer still blessed the soil before planting. The names had changed, but the soul of the people, that deep, ancestral yearning for connection to something greater, endured. Yet, in quiet corners of England, the old gods lingered. In the names of days, Wednesday for Woden, Thursday for Thunor, Friday for Frege, they hid in plain sight, embedded in the heartbeat of the language itself. Every time those words are spoken, the past whispers again. The old faith survives not in temples or idols, but in the breath of speech, in the roots of English identity. And perhaps they were never meant to vanish. The gods of the heathen age were not evil. They were reflections of human awe, the thunder, the fire, the mystery of birth and death. Christianity did not destroy them. It inherited their longing for light. When the church bell rang where once the horn had sounded, both spoke to the same sky. In the end, the silence of the gods was not defeat. It was a transformation, the world learning a new way to dream. Their names were forgotten, but their spirit endured, sleeping beneath cathedrals, whispering in oak leaves, echoing in the English soul. Every rune, every prayer, every word of the language still carries a shadow of that forgotten divinity. Because the past is never truly gone, it's waiting to be reborn.